Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second session in our Festival of Learning under the What Works programme. Today, you're very welcome to join us and participate in this session, which is entitled Strengthening Prevention in Policy. And I'm really looking forward to this session. As you know, this builds on a session we had on Tuesday, which was Championing Prevention and Early Intervention, and this is the follow-on from that. The second of 4 sessions over the next 2 weeks on the Festival of Learning and Strengthening Prevention and Early Intervention in Policy, Practice and Delivery. So I'm really looking forward to this session. I just want to set the scene. We have an hour in terms of presentations, and we will also look at trying to get some generative questions amongst the presenters. But also on that, we have, as you can see on the screen, a speech bubble, and we'll be looking for questions from yourselves, the audience, in terms of any issues you would like to bring up with the presenters we have here. But also, if anything piques your interest or imagination, we'd welcome some of your proposed solutions to some of the problems we're trying to address here in terms of prevention and early intervention and strengthening that in policy. If we were to ask ourselves around trying to ground prevention and early intervention and where does it exist at the moment, I think COVID, as I mentioned on Tuesday, is a very interesting test case for prevention and early intervention. Everyone that is on the call here at the moment is in a situation where public health has led to taking a firm preventative and early interventionist approach to the COVID crisis. So it's very much writ large in the lives we're living at the moment. The challenge for us is how do we ensure that we put an emphasis on prevention and early intervention in other aspects of social services provision, not just health provision. So these will be key issues that we would hope to tease out today. I'd like to introduce the speakers that we have, and we're really fortunate to have 4 very interesting and insightful contributors. I'd like to introduce Paul Carney, who's the Professor of Public Policy and Politics at Stirling University in Scotland, who has written and researched extensively on this issue. Paul will present to us anon. Following on from that, we have Elizabeth Canavan, who is the Assistant Secretary in the Department of An Taoiseach, or our Prime Minister's Department for those people outside of the country. Liz has responsibility for social policy and the overview of that across government, and has significant experience in other line departments in terms of cultivating prevention and early intervention and putting it on the agenda in terms of a government focus. Following on from that, we have Fiachra Kennedy, and Fiachra up until recently has led the Prevention and Early Intervention Unit in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, which is another central department within our government ministries. Fiachra has done extensive research on this area over the last number of years, and now Fiachra is building on the prevention and early intervention focus to look at well-being across government through his work in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. And finally, but by no means least, we have Barbara Hage from Tallinn in Estonia. And Barbara works for the Social Insurance Board in Estonia, which is a cradle-to-grave governmental organisation with a focus on cradle-to-grave issues in terms of well-being and prevention for all the citizens in Estonia. And Barbara will tell us a bit more about her work as we go on. So thank you and welcome. Looking forward, as I said, to a good generative discussion. And I'm going to ask Paul Carney to come in now and give us his perspectives and observations on strengthening and championing prevention in policy. So over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you. So I brought some slides, but I'm not sure if they're there.
Yes, they're there. We can see them.
Oh, they're there. Okay. Right. Okay. So I can't see them. Okay. So that's going to freak me out a little bit. Okay. So The first slide should be a cover of a book that I wrote with Emily St Denny. And the question we ask in there is why isn't government policy more preventive? So I think the preface to that is this is about UK and Scottish governments both using the phrase prevention is better than cure continuously for a long time. You know, you can trace it back to the UK government since, you know, the 40s, and the Scottish government announced a decisive shift to prevention in 2011. So our question is, given that they're so committed to this approach, you know, why do we find so much limited success? So I suppose I'm the voice of doom here. I know this session's about uplifting things, but I think we'll get you down first before we can uplift you again. So the first way into that is this question we ask, what is prevention, or what is prevention and early intervention? And they're slightly different, but prevention, the first thing you would say is it's a policy, you know, our policy aim, but then that can have different elements. So that can be the idea we're intervening early in people's lives to improve the well-being, reduce inequalities, and or reduce costs. So some people choose one of those things, and some get a bit greedy and think we can do them all with the same policy. The second is it's a policy-making philosophy or approach. So when people talk about prevention, they're also talking about things like intersectoral action and joining up government, dealing with wicked problems, focusing on long-term outcomes rather than short-term targets, and using phrases like assets base instead of finding problems with communities, and the idea of doing things with you or with stakeholders rather than to them. And at least in the Scottish and UK governments, it comes with this commitment to decentralisation or localist policies rather than doing it all from central government. And then the third element is often that people express this hope or intention that their approach is evidence-based or at least evidence-informed. So I think that's the kind of high-level way you might sum up prevention and early intervention. And I think early intervention, is often used more for under fives, whereas prevention can be maybe a much more across the life course. Like you can still prevent people going into hospital in old age, that sort of thing. So here's the kind of voice of doom, slide 3, which is the 3 reasons we give for, these are very broad reasons for why we might find limited success. And the first is about ambiguity. So ambiguity, I think, is a lack of a clear sense of what people mean by their policy aims, or some debate about what policy or prevention means. So ambiguity is really good when you're trying to generate support. It's very difficult to find too many people who are against the idea of preventing before curing. But I think it's largely because it's very difficult to know what it actually means in practice. So the first question you might ask is, what exactly is the problem you're solving? Because really it's a solution rather than a problem. The second thing is, what tools do you have in mind, or your policy tools or instruments? So some people have in mind major economic redistribution to solve inequalities. Some people have in mind policy interventions with public services. Some people have in mind a central government sharing information with local government and encouraging them to do something different. And those are remarkably different intentions. And then there's a classic divide between primary, secondary and tertiary prevention. So primary would be akin to a whole population inoculation, where tertiary is really just trying to stop something, prevent something getting worse that's already arisen. Okay, whereas secondary, I think, is identifying high risk, so-called high risk groups. So the second explanation, which is the big one we focus on, which is policymaking complexity, and the idea that, at least in Scottish and UK government context, they project this image of being in control of that agenda, but they struggle to understand and control what happens. And they have these dilemmas that they face. Should they try and deal with that by specialising within particular departments or agencies, or try and join up many of them? Or should they try and centralise some of that and localise some of it? So they've got these dilemmas of policymaking that deal with their kind of limited control. And the third classic explanation is that there's no such thing as evidence-based policymaking, or a kind of classic phrase is, evidence doesn't give you a magic bullet to solve these problems. Okay, so these are kind of classic things. And okay, the next slide is a table that we usually don't have much time to go over, but it really is just a way of signalling that even when people talk about evidence-based interventions or evidence-based best practice or scaling up, you can have very different and potentially contradictory things in mind. So I think the classic way that I've called implementation science, but I think some people would not call it this, but the classic is, evidence-based prevention is you identify the best evidence from randomized controlled trials, you then find out what works, and you have to roll them out uniformly, and the idea is that you need some fidelity to the model. But there are very different ways to encourage best practice in which instead you focus much more on practitioner knowledge, sharing stories between each other, stressing governance principles and localism and respect. And there are very different philosophies behind two very different ways to think of evidence-informed policymaking. And a lot of issues that come up are people have very different ideas about what they mean by evidence-informed and how to scale up and such like. In that context, I think things like improvement method, which is the third column, are often sold as the best of both worlds or a compromise model, but they really just raise different issues or different compromises. So I guess we could talk about that more if anyone would like. And then just to pile on the problem side, I've listed the kind of most common problems that people would talk about when they say why prevention or early intervention didn't go as far as they wanted. So the obvious one is that the scale of the task is so large it seems overwhelming. When people realize what they've gotten themselves into, it's very difficult to know where they start. And it's not particularly suited to 4 or 5 year elections when it's a long-term, decades-long agenda. They also have these problems with performance management, which is often geared towards short-term targets and account within a small number of years, when really they want these long-term outcome well-being measures that are much harder to pin down and satisfy people that they're making progress. There's also a competition for attention and money with much more acute problems and services. So preventive health struggles to compete with healthcare and hospitals, for example, or well-being, I think, struggles to compete with very tangible public services that people can point to. Okay, and I suppose one of the final reasons is we call these problems wicked for a reason. The wicked means intractable and very difficult to even understand or solve. So it would give us a sense of kind of managing expectations. And I think the final one I'll raise there is the ethical dilemmas. So a lot of early intervention is really about intervention in people's lives and family lives, and state intervention, before someone's given birth or before their child is 5, and the real dilemmas about the extent to which the state should be involved in encouraging or telling people what to do. And I think when governments face those dilemmas and they see that it's very difficult to do and they find it very difficult to account for the outcomes, all those things can come together and put governments off. Okay, so I think one of the questions we were thinking about was, how universal are these conclusions? So I quite like they're a little bit less threatening because they're about the UK and Scottish government. Okay, so they're less worrying than if I was doing analysis of Ireland. But I would say I would avoid misdiagnosing this problem as taking place somewhere else or to do with low political will or the incompetence of politicians in the UK. That's often what governments come in and do. They say, okay, well, the previous government failed because they were not good at their jobs or they were not sincere. And I think that's a problem because what we research is what happens even when they are competent and sincere. They'll still face the things we say. And if we don't recognize that and try and address it, then we'll really just contribute to this cycle of despair where a new government will come in full of enthusiasm and activity, and then after a couple of years we'll be disenchanted, and then they'll be replaced by another government that does the same thing. Okay, so that I guess is the problem we're seeking to solve. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. That's really interesting, and I think it sets the stage really well for some key questions, and the theme obviously will be taken up by the different speakers. I just have a question, if you don't mind, Paul, in terms of the presentation or the perception of prevention and early intervention. Sometimes we present it, or it's perceived as kind of motherhood and apple pie, and it's nice to have How do we take it a bit more seriously, or should the concept be interrogated a bit more? Because surely it's effective prevention, early intervention, not just a benign concept that if we do something, things will work out well. Might you have any observations on that?
Yeah, I do. Because my background is in politics, I would just say all of this is about making political choices. So I think if we're too ambiguous about what prevention means, it means we're just pushing back those choices down the road for other people to make. And you probably should say it's elected governments who should be making those high-level value choices from the beginning rather than letting people interpret them. So I think, the first choice would be, what kind of evidence and centralization process are they thinking about? Are they talking about using RCTs and rolling them out across the country with no real discretion? Are they really talking about a broad philosophy of being more respectful to local communities and stakeholders and looking for ideas? And those are essentially contradictory things, aren't they? So they really should make up their mind first so that people know what they're doing, or else it'll just be this kind of real kind of fudge or muddle, throughout that process.
That's really interesting, Paul, and I think it speaks to some of our experiences in this country in terms of prevention, early intervention, and the successes and the learnings we've experienced during the process. So, can I just segue quite smoothly, if possible, over to Liz? And as I said, Liz Canavan is in a central position in the Irish government, significant experience of championing prevention, early intervention. But Liz, can I ask you your observations on strengthening or championing prevention in social services across government?
Thanks, Conor. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So thanks very much, Paul. I was really interested in your presentation, and obviously I had a look at it beforehand, some of what you've been saying. So I guess, there's a lot of, I think it reflects well in very similar ways to what the Irish experience has been. And I guess I was trying to think about what is it that is going wrong, should we say, and I'll come back to, is anything going wrong? But as you say, often there's a sense that there's some kind of resistance to this at a policy level, or that, as you say, there's a bit of incompetence involved. So I was thinking about, why don't we do prevention better? So I said, who's we? So I said, okay, well, that's kind of the political system. There's people like me, and Conor and co at FIACRA who are trying to make policy and advise government. And then there's obviously providers and practitioners. So I sort of went through what makes us not do prevention so well. So I suppose starting with the political system, I suppose the first thing I'd say is they probably mean to. They probably think it's a bit easier than it actually is. And I think it's fair to say that the here and now problems have to be dealt with. So very often they're the things that have to be resourced and prioritised. And sometimes, increasingly the research helps us to understand there's value in prevention and early intervention, but the counterfactual can be a bit theoretical, and it's definitely longer term. So that makes it a challenge. And the other thing politically, and I've seen this even recently in some work we're doing with the Department of Justice. So the political pressure is for something real time and immediate, and they definitely like the local, because that's where they come from, that's what they build their base on, and they do understand the local. But I guess then there's a tension between that and having a centralised long-term, with this sort of strategic benefits approach, and it's that tension, I suppose, and I think you refer to that as well. In terms of people like myself, I suppose, up until, I suppose, the last number of years, we would argue that the data and research hasn't always been there. Now that has improved dramatically, I would say, particularly in the children's field, but right across the board. I think the other thing is, and you mentioned it as well, sometimes we're presented with propositions from outside the system as if they're magic bullets, and there aren't really magic bullets, and sometimes advocates like to suggest there is. So then you get into this sort of tension there as well, where you're trying to say, well, look, we want to hear what you're saying, but we're not buying the magic bullet theory, because there are no magic bullets really. And I think it's also fair to say that policymakers, they have to make choices, and very often prevention and early intervention is intended to replace the further down the continuum problems. So inevitably you're talking about moving resources. That means you have to stop something or ration something or switch something. And when resources are rationed generally, that's very hard to make. And it's a very high risk to stop doing something. And again, it brings you back into sort of the political world. I also think it's, and I mean, you touch on this, but I think it's a real issue that departments, individual government departments have discrete objectives. They have missions. And very often they're trying to figure out how to expend their energy and their currency. So if there are cross-agency, cross-government wicked problems, the wicked problem is compounded by the wicked problem that I don't want to be left holding the baby, literally. And I don't know if I'm going to get the thanks for the work I'm doing. I don't know if I have the resources or will anyone else help me out. And the financial resourcing systems don't lend themselves to that kind of sharing. And that's where the key incentive can be. And then I suppose in terms of providers and practitioners, I mean, we've loads of fantastic champions out there in the system, we know that, and they have so much advice to give us about the real world, the real front line. But no matter what you're doing, changing systems is hard, and sometimes we don't do that change management piece. And providers often have a lot of confidence in what they're doing at the moment. And can be the same as policymakers are a little bit nervous. And they can also gatekeep the professional areas, because sometimes what we're asking for here is more blended kind of provision, a more blended kind of practice, and that can be challenging too. And I think it's fair to say for a lot of practitioners, having that continuous professional development opportunity, that continuous improvement culture, which I think things like this event and the What Works programme is trying to drive, is really important, because we haven't always, practitioners don't have that space. They're under a lot of pressure, particularly in social and health services. So I suppose to summarise what I'd say is the challenges aren't unique to prevention policy. So I think the spirit is willing, but the flesh is a bit weak sometimes. And I think that shared ownership and control is just that tension between devolution and accountability, and that happens at every level. And I think I was thinking about what's the answer. So I suppose I'll finish on an upbeat note. I think we're doing an awful lot of prevention and early intervention. And I can look across policy areas that we have been working on for many years. And we're probably getting to the stage now where we've got on top of the here and now problems, and we can now start beginning to go back through the root cause problems. So it's not that surprising that we have to get on top of the here and now problems. And I could give you examples across health, older people, mental health, disability, even housing, where we're trying to go back and get more to the root cause and stop the here and now getting bigger. So I don't think it's that we're not doing it, but I do think we need to be much more systematic about how we're doing it. I think the policy processes in the modern world have to be very transparently drawing in evidence, you know, the news from the front in terms of how things work. And we need to be really upfront about how we're doing that. And I think if we can be more transparent about that and more systematic about it, I think politicians have more confidence. There's a foundation for what they're trying to do. And I think that we can bring more people along with us. But I do think that's happening. It's a matter of systematizing it a bit more and embedding it a bit more in the way we do our everyday business. But that goes for all policy. I think there's a lot of pressure on public policy generally. There's so many platforms for people to debate and to give very one-sided views perhaps. And it's trying to get through all those weeds and have a systematic way of doing it. But I actually think we're doing reasonably well. I think there's an awful lot of really good groundwork. We've an awful lot of people out there at every level in the system who want to champion this. So I think it's systematizing it, making it part of the culture of how we do policy making and how we work at a practice level. And I do think there's something about the financial resourcing systems that are acting as a disincentive for departments to plan and work together, and that's a harder nut to crack. So that's my sort of take on things from the Irish point of view.
Liz, thank you, and that's really interesting. I thought the realpolitik that you bring to the debate is really interesting, and I think we should bear that in mind. And some of those challenging pieces in terms of gatekeeping, you know, whether that's departmentally or whether that's sectorally. You also hit on another point, and maybe it's a bit of projection on my part, but do we have too much specific thematic policy, and is that compounding divisions within departments and across departments? And I think that's something that could be considered. Also, the point around having the luxury at the front line, and we referenced this on Tuesday, all roads lead to the front line in this, and the front line is more crucial and more important now more than ever. And I think we can all understand that, whether that's in retail or in health or in social services. But that idea of having the luxury to engage with some of these key issues is somewhat often not afforded, or practitioners maybe aren't able to do that. The concept also that you mentioned around proving, and I think that it sings to some of the work of Dale Blythe in Minnesota, who we've discussed with before, but that concept from moving from proving to improving, and I think that's a critical piece in terms of grounding and developing prevention and early intervention. Okay, we have a number of questions coming in here, and I'm going to hold on those, but also, as I said before, if things pique your interest or imagination, if you have potential solutions to some of these dilemmas, please feed these in as well. But I'm going to go on to Fiachra Kennedy now and ask Fiachra for his input in terms of championing prevention in public policy. Thank you, Fiachra. Fiachra, I think you're muted. Do we have Fiachra?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you now, Fiachra.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sorry, that's the problem when you have a choice of two buttons, one on your headset and one on the screen in front of you. Right, we're really pleased to be invited to participate in this. I think there's a lot of very interesting perspectives. What I'd like to do is talk about DEPR's perspective now. Obviously, we don't have any money to hand out, and we don't have any responsibility for any of these policies and programs. But what we do have, I think, and what's important, is that we have that sort of treasury or central government department interest in that public resources, that limited public resources are used to efficiently to deliver effective public services, that whole sort of value for money thing. And from that, DEPR over the last decade have been involved in designing and implementing a variety of different reforms that have tried to increase the focus on what's being done with public money, what services are being provided, and how effective these services are in terms of achieving policy goals. So things like the spending reviews, performance budgeting, equality budgeting. And also there's been the development of the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service, which has helped to increase the capacity of the civil service in general to carry out this sort of work. So this perspective has shaped the work that I've undertaken as part of the Prevention and Early Intervention Unit in DEPR over the last 3 years. So one thing we've done is we've looked at 9 key policies and programs in the areas of health, older people, children, young people and their families, and we've looked at sort of the rationale and the policy challenges that these programs and policies try to address, the resources that have been provided, the services delivered, and how these programs have their achievements against their policy objectives. But we've also kind of stepped back from that kind of traditional policy analysis, and we held a series of dialogues with policy experts and practitioners to examine how they think about PEI and what it means to them. More recently, we've compared these key policies to try and step back from the detail of the individual policies and programs to try and see across the different policy domains, are there ways or learnings or insights we can get looking at the different policies and programs to try and help improve the design and implementation of prevention and early intervention. And then also with Ruth Doggett in the Department of Children and Youth Affairs and Sarah Gibney in the Department of Health, we've tried to examine PEI through a policy cycle to try and kind of see how can evidence fit into the different stages of that policy cycle to try and inform and enhance the design and implementation of policy. So that paper, the policy cycle one and the comparative one, have thankfully been published today. So they're on the budget website, and we'll be sticking them up on the IG's website in the next few days. So I think in thinking about how to strengthen the position of prevention within public policy, it's no harm to kind of look back over the years and see how it has been strengthened over time. It's not a historical analysis that I'm going to outline, but it's more of a sketch. I think sort of when you look internationally, you can see it's been around for a long time. So you can see the work of Dr. Elizabeth Bone when she established the National Health Society in the 1870s. Sort of more locally, you know, the vaccines against smallpox were introduced in Ireland in the 1860s. There was a kind of an educational welfare approach from the 1890s, where children living in urban areas are required to go to school for 75 days. But it's not really until the late 1980s where you began to see a real surge in kind of prevention and early intervention within the policy environment in Ireland. So you can think of things like the ECHLS pilot program for cancer screening from the late 1980s, which was then followed by a huge volume of policy development in cancer screening in the 1990s. Similar in the area of childcare and early learning, there was significant policy work in the 1990s, which was then supplemented further by a focus on programmatic interventions, which was then followed on by things like Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures, the First Five, and the ABC programs in more recent times. There was the Commission on Families report from the late 1990s, and there's been an increased salience on focus on health and well-being in older people through the National Positive Aging Strategy, and in particular the work that TILDA have produced. So there's quite a lot has been going on, and that kind of the strengthening and an increased emphasis in more recent decades. But I think so there's that momentum, and I think when you're thinking about how you strengthen prevention in policy now, you have to do so in thinking about in the context of that momentum that I just sort of described or outlined. And perhaps there's a risk that all of this momentum around prevention or intervention results in it being seen as something unique, that it's something for the children, it's something for the older people, but it's kind of over there, and it's not, and it gets lost from the broader sort of policy environment. And perhaps if we're going to strengthen prevention within policy, what we need to start doing is locating it more clearly within the policy challenges that government and government policy tries to address, and that it's part of that broader suite of actions that government can take. That, you know, prevention is an element of addressing the policy challenge. It focuses in on reducing risk or in strengthening supportive factors, but that it does so in the context of other policy responses that are trying to address the challenge that people have encountered, or policies that are trying to enhance the ability of people to develop their capabilities to develop. So, you know, these policy challenges, it's not a greenfield site. You know, the problems are there, and there's different ways of trying to address it, of which prevention is one. So when you think about screening, you know, you're trying to identify risk in people who aren't showing any symptoms, and that when that risk is identified, you're providing them with treatment pathways, but you're also trying to treat the disease or illness that they actually are exhibiting symptoms for. And then with early learning and other kind of interventions for young people and their families, you know, that kind of thing can work in tandem with the more formal schooling system, and that, you know, it can help enhance the capacity of children to benefit from subsequent stages in their education. When you try to broaden that perspective out, that you're trying to locate prevention and early intervention in the context of these policy challenges, what it brings is the kind of issues that Paul was talking about in relation to complexity and how these kind of things can impact on policy design and implementation. So, you know, everyone's go-to example when they think about prevention or intervention is vaccines. You know, while the science, and it's all very topical at the moment, obviously, and while the science behind it can be very complex, the challenge itself is reasonably straightforward in that you've got clear outcomes. People either get sick or they don't get sick, and you understand the probabilities around those outcomes of happening. The intervention is reasonably straightforward. It's sort of roll up your sleeve and take your jab, and there's a clear link between the service and the outcome. But when you come to policy in relation to children, young people and their families, the challenges are more complex. It can be very difficult to define the intended outcome. It can be difficult to measure those outcomes. And as Paul said, you know, we call them wicked problems for very good reasons. The interventions can be complex. You can be looking at multiple actors trying to deliver multiple interventions at different levels in the context of having multiple outcomes and that those outcomes can change over time. So examples of those kind of things are children and family services and the aftercare program, where it's not especially straightforward. So from a policy perspective, this complexity presents challenges in that, where the intervention is reasonably simple, like in terms of vaccines, you can get clear links between what's the intended outcome and the direction of challenge. But when it comes to more complex policy interventions, the challenge is that when it comes to setting out the policy objective, there's a tendency to talk about the services that are to be provided as opposed to setting out, well, what's the benefit that people will observe and
I think
with the interventions.
Fiachra, I think we're losing your connection at the moment, but I think we might just move on. But I just think that really interesting comments there around the outcomes, also the differentiating between the clinical approach and the more complex approach in terms of human social services, and then critically what you mentioned is we're not working or operating in a greenfield site, and very often the implementation science approach presupposes that things are clean and clear, but we're very much in a brownfield site in terms of the complexity of policy interventions, etc. So critical challenges for us. Fiachra, I have a question that for yourself that's come in and for Liz, but I'm going to hold that again, and we're going to go on to Barbara if that's okay. So Barbara, could I ask you to come in from your Estonian perspective? Thank you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Barbara.
I'll do a 5-minute pitch. So Paul, I would like to say thank you for writing a book of story of my work life, because that's pretty much how it is. But in really briefly in 5 minutes, first off, I would like to say, and I didn't hear so much about this during this topic here, and maybe it's in your book, but what I see, the first basis problem is the knowledge of prevention is so different. People do not learn about prevention theories today in the universities, at least in Estonia. We just started actually teaching prevention science as of 2019 autumn, and it's only in one university. So maybe it's somewhere written in the book as well. I'm sorry I haven't read it, but what I see and in my everyday life with work to struggle is that people are not even aware of the 3 different levels of prevention. So how can we assume that prevention is done correctly or that it's effective if people, every ministry, every local government, every profession has their own knowledge of prevention? So there's already like written in an error. And another thing that I would like to go quickly through is when you ask how to strengthen prevention, then what we are trying to do in our organization is actually through local governments. And it starts from analyzing actually what the problems are. And Paul, you actually mentioned that. And what we see is that local governments tend to buy in analyses from private sectors, private companies who basically do an analyze, which normally ends up with suggestions of you should have more schools, you should have more kindergartens, and so on, but not in depth. What's the welfare issue? How's the social policy, the education issue? These are things that are not analyzed, and everything in prevention, before we actually go and start offering any type of service, a program, or whatever other intervention, it requires an analyze. What actually my problem is? What am I going to tackle? And then after that, what the local governments want and what they need is an action plan. Normally you will get an analyze and they will just put it in the drawer, or you will just leave it for the next party to come and rule the local government, and then that's that. What they need is an action plan. An action plan must consist of a time frame. And not only that, but it has to consist of measuring. How do we measure the effectiveness? And now here's another issue, that it's very easy to use quantitative analyzing. Oh, I had so many people in my training, so many people used my programs. But what they're tackling and what the government is tackling as well is this qualitative research. How do I analyze whether my work has been good or not? So yeah, of course I agree with everything that you said, that we need to choose evidence-based programs or interventions, but for us, for example, in our country, only next week, 6 or 7 ministries are sitting down to finally agree on what is prevention, and that we should actually choose minimum. The level should be science-based prevention. Evidence-based is already something like a space, if you would like to say, but we should like tackle that area for sure. And that's how we see, or at least how I see it. So measuring action plan and analyzing the problems and strengthening through local governments and the local community. But for that to happen, everyone has to understand what prevention is. So these are just my quick thoughts, because I can see how much time it already is, and I would like to people have the chance to ask questions. So yeah.
Barbara, that was really interesting from your perspective in Estonia and being somewhat familiar with the work there. I think the work in Estonia in social services has been a real rejoinder to that concept and implementation science that things take about 7 years to work their way through. I think the level of speed and with effect that Estonia has advanced a range of different issues has been so impressive. And again, a point we made the other day, when we're looking at prevention, early intervention, we very often looked to the States, and perhaps we should have looked to Europe as well and member states. And the work in Estonia is really impressive. So thank you for that perspective. Can I just, having heard the different inputs, can I open it up to our 4 speakers do you have any items you'd like to raise in terms of following up questions with your respective contributors? Paul, can we take you, please?
Handwork. I mean, I just was taking some notes based on what the other speakers were saying, and just to follow up some of them. I mean, one of the themes is how do you measure progress and what works? I mean, I guess that's a key theme of what you're doing, and I think it was instructive. In the UK, they had this problem with Sure Start. So they were importing Head Start from the US, and the evidence of progress from the US was based on randomized control trials. But then the UK government said to local areas, you make sense of this. This is about localism and this is about working with stakeholders. So of course, each of them produced something different. And so then they commissioned an evaluation, and the evaluators said, we have no idea if this is working because you've broken the rules we use to measure. And I think the alternative, is the Family Intervention Project, where essentially that is counterfactual. It is, here's what happened, and we think it would have been much worse if we didn't do something. So I think those are your choices, aren't they? And none of them are particularly good choices about measuring progress. I mean, a lot of them are sort of political choices about what you're going to hang your hat on, I think.
Great, thanks, Paul. I'm going to bring in Barbara there, who wants to respond or come in on the point.
Yeah, just like the policy thing, that is so affecting as well, that when a policy or politician has it in their head that we for sure want to have that program, this is so common as well, that we bring in programs or interventions which showed really good results from UK we have brought as well. Oh, we want to do it. We sure do it. We'll put it in our policy, in our action plan for the next 2-3 years. But in reality, maybe it's not going to work. We're not planning to measure. So there's no big evaluation about the policy. I just wanted to comment. I always say that working in a government level, the policy flag reminds me of the really big one, which is in front of the parliament, going really slow. As you go down to the local level, the flag is like super small, and it just goes so fast, and it's so stressing for the workers because the changes, they come so heavily. If there is no agreement or no paper signed, no changes will happen, because as soon as the next party comes into force, then again all the agreements are washed off the table and on to next key issues, which are not anymore that. That's why we say that when we do the analyze for the local governments, when we offer the service, it's mandatory that it should move in the same pace as the strategic plan is moving, so that the analyze can already put into the local government's strategic plan, which is mandatory by law for 4 years. If it's not written there, there's zero chance of getting any funding or that the issues will be tackled. So this is very clear that you have to understand the policy dance, I say, and you have to move with that dance. It's sadly but surely it is. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Barbara. I'm going to bring in Liz in now.
Yeah, thanks, Conor. I think just back to that question about, sometimes, and certainly we did it here too, we think about prevention and early intervention, and we sort of take these programs and we take a very programmatic approach. And that was a useful part of our evolution. I wouldn't take away from that for a second. But the same issues arise all the time. So you want to devolve it, you want the front line to inform it. And then they start doing their own thing. Oh my God, they start doing their own thing. And then someone somewhere is accountable if you've put money into it. And then we're saying, what are we measuring anyway? Oh, well, they didn't quite do it that way. And we did a massive evaluation here of various programs, including some that were RCT'd. And like, it was all good stuff, we didn't do any harm, for sure. And some things definitely looked like they were very, very promising and very good. But actually, when you looked at the overall evaluation, it was kind of like, yeah, it was grand, but we never evaluated what we were doing anyway. Do you know what I mean? And what we found was, as you looked at certain parts of the country, and we're a small country, you had individual champions working for the last 20 years in areas. And when you looked, you saw very peculiar things around the rates of children in care that were actually just down to a local practitioner, a local culture, a local leader. So we weren't evaluating actually what was already going on. So I guess I found that the journey that I was on with people like Conor and lots of people on the call, I'm sure, it was a really important part of our journey to do that program thing and really to understand evaluation and to interrogate what the outcomes should be. But actually, I think we need to sort of mainstream the kind of approach, the thinking style, rather than the programs. And maybe that's too much of a let-off, but I actually think, and I see this right across every policy, we just need to keep looking and hearing and listening to because the problems are changing. I mean, the problems that families and children and people generally, they're changing. Like, look at mental health for young people. I mean, it is a completely different set of presentations now than it was even 10 years ago. So the problems keep changing. So we have to kind of keep pace with that as well. So for me, I think that was a really important part of our journey, and it embedded some really important concepts. But actually, it was as much about a way of thinking and a way of being open to what everyone has to offer, whether it be from the ground or from high academia, that we have to sort of bring all those things together and just keep learning and keep responding and keep rethinking. So that's much more important, I think.
Thanks, Liz. And I think you make a very valid point around maturing through the process in terms of what the needs are. Instead of just getting hung up with more research or data, I think they're factors that impact the colour of the approach and the response. So really important. I'm going to go to a question now, and a range of questions coming in, very interesting ones. Some quite niche in terms of sectoral questions. So I'm going to just go for the kind of high level overarching ones, and one particularly for Barbara from Francis Chance. And Francis asked, Barbara, which ministries are sitting down together to agree on what prevention is, and how did you make that happen?
Yeah, Ministry of Social Affairs, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Interiors, Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Education, and under the Ministry of Interior, we currently have separately family policy as well. So, and then we have Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well, I think. Not sure, I don't remember the sixth one. Basically, what happened was this is a long ongoing process that we have a document called the Cross-Sectoral Prevention Concept. And what we're trying to do is agree upon this concept of how and we do prevention and what role each ministry and under 3 ministries there are 3 networks that are working directly for prevention. So we're trying to put it all together, and this document has been in the making for about 3 or 4 years. So it's not an easy thing to do, and it's just been ongoing, and now we're trying to agree upon the document. But let me say it's very, very difficult, particularly due to the fact that when we agree upon that science-based or evidence-based are like really required and mandatory, then this means that we're not able to fund everything that pops up to our door. Someone does a great pitch and says, use my program. So it's an ongoing process since 4 years, and it happened 4 years ago thanks to policy, that there was at that time a government that decided prevention is important, and at least the document started rolling. But as you can see, as policy changes, so do priorities. But now we're actually at this process that we're going to agree upon it. Yeah, hopefully, fingers crossed.
Great, thank you, Barbara. A range of questions coming in, and I would suggest some of the responses, perhaps, or the developments can be found on whatworks.gov.ie, which is the website that this initiative is based on, but also crucially in the supportingchildren.gov.ie, which is the range of responses I mentioned on Tuesday in terms of responding to COVID and the systems and supports and structures that are there from state agencies and CMV sector. So back to the question, and it's less a question, but it is a question, but I'm not going to elicit answers for this, but I'll just put it out there. And it's from Catherine Whitty in Centre for Effective Services, and it's can a government cross-party approach to prevention to early intervention, example funding prioritisation, be agreed to sustain commitment to longer term goals? And the example used there is Sláinte Care. And I think it's a really interesting point in trying to get a vehicle for what we're trying to talk about, and it's a good point. I'm also going to go to a question from Casey Threadwell-Shine, who is with the Department of Social Protection, and she has an interesting point. She said the speakers have highlighted a fundamental constraint in policy making, that policies are broadly confined to a single domain, but people's lived experiences don't fit discrete social policy domains. Can prevention give us a different perspective and a different path to knowledge that works from an intuitive sense of the messiness of life? Liz, I'm going to come to you on that, but I think it's a really interesting question, and anyone who's involved in policy making knows that's a key challenge. Liz.
So thanks for that, Conor. I mean, I'm not sure if I entirely agree with the premise in a way. I think there's two bits to it. I think departments are organised, as Casey said, you know, in quite siloed ways. It's hard to think of a model that doesn't do that in some way, shape or form, and we slice and dice them in different ways to make certain things work better together, and we do a lot of that in this country, as you all know, especially in the Department of Children. So I'm not sure if the structures is the challenge. So then is it the policy that's the challenge? So from where I sit, you know, I chair the Senior Officials Group on Social Policy. So all cross-government social policy that's going to Cabinet comes through a Cabinet committee. So in fact, what I see loads of cross-government policy. And the challenge is that I often get in these cross-government policies and I say to the lead department, you do realise half of this is already government policy, it's just in a different policy. So in fact, you get all this repetition, and we have policies upon policies, and if you boil it all down, you still have the 10 or 20 wicked problems that actually we're all still wrestling with. So there is a lot of work done on trying to make the policy more cross-cutting, but it's actually the implementation and the resourcing and the prioritisation that's the challenge. So, and it's back to, I think, what I was sort of mentioned earlier, this tension within departments. I have a core mission, and I can see this more than I ever could when I was in a line department. I have a core mission. I know what I'm going to be measured on, and there's lots of stuff I'd love to be involved in, and maybe I am involved in, and I help a bit, but I'll be measured on my core mission. And if I don't have the resources to deliver some of this cross-government stuff, it's very hard to use up either my energy, my financial resources, or my currency with others, because I might be trying to leverage something else. And there's something about that has to change, I think, to create the incentives to do that in a better way. I don't think we lack thinking around joined up policy. I think we lack thinking about how to implement that in a really shared ownership way, and a way that's, we share the accountability for it. We always end up saying, who's the lead department? Every department always wants to know, who's the lead department? Who's leading on this? Because they're the ones who are going to have to account for themselves, even if there's a trail of other people who actually have to make it happen. So there's something systemic we have to get at there, and I think that's much harder.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to come in there before we wrap up? Okay, Paul, please.
Sorry, just briefly. I mean, I suppose one kind of common solution to the coordination is to have one relatively powerful body to kind of cajole the others to do things. It's usually a treasury, isn't it? But I think the issue then is usually that the treasury then is quite an unpopular body, and departments don't like the interference. So there's always those internal politics that you get. But I mean, there's one story I like, which is the UK Treasury. It tried to do something like that. It was either talking about the need for cashable savings rather than mythical savings. But it was also doing this with its families policy, in which it said to local authorities, "We'll give you some of the money just now. Then when you show us it's working, we'll give you the rest." And that sounds okay in theory, isn't it? But they had a really strong political incentive to declare success. There's no one really in the system who is going to say, "Oh, we did this and we failed," because they won't get the money, and the government won't be able to declare success in the next election. So there are ways to deal with it, I think, but they're not particularly good ways. I mean, it's all trying to find the least bad option, I think.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm going to ask our speakers to just think for a few moments in terms of their takeaway points they'd like to give to the audience. And just to say, we have an audience of about 400 people on this call, so that's the upside of virtual conferences. So I'm going to ask you to think about some of those takeaway points. And while you do that, I just want to say to people, as I mentioned at the outset, this is the second session. Our next session is next week, and you can please sign up for that. I think there are spaces available, obviously. And that is with looking at entrepreneurial thinking in social services. And we have a phenomenal speaker, Professor Mary Walsh from Boston College, and she will be talking about her work. And quite interestingly, we're trialling some of the work that she has led, such as the Boston City Connects model in the northeast inner city of Dublin in the schools. So there's a practical application to that input. And also the following session will be on artificial intelligence. So some interesting sessions. And as you can see, the theme as we deliver and develop these sessions, they're building upon what went before and trying to get further under the bonnet in terms of some of these issues. So can I go to, I might start with you, Barbara, in terms of takeaway points, and then I'll go to Fiacre, Liz and Paul.
Yeah, so I'm just going to say the same sentence which I used when I created my short pitch. If I would ever have the chance to talk to an investor who wants to invest in prevention a huge load of money, I would say that prevention is often invisible, but if we do prevention through knowingly cooperating systematically and coordinated, we can make it visible.
Okay. Really interesting. Thanks, Barbara. And I think a really good point to make around the visibility, defining, refining, showing how it's integrated and showing its impact. Fiacre, can I go to you, please, in terms of a takeaway point?
Yep, sure. I think we need to recognise a lot has been done, particularly over the last couple of decades, but in doing that we need to be careful that prevention, early intervention isn't a victim of its own apparent simplicity. And in particular, we need to start looking at how to strengthen alignments between prevention and early intervention and the other sort of policy interactions by being really clear about what the policy challenges is they're trying to address. I think we also need to be more careful about how we acknowledge the role of complexity, and that we need to be really honest and upfront and transparent about and clear about what is known, what can be done, and what can be achieved.
Great, thank you, Fiacre. Really important points. Liz, can I go to you, please?
Thanks, Conor. Yeah, I'm kind of with Fiacre. I think we should sort of take away, we're doing well, you know, we are doing well. There's lots of support for this, and I can say that with a bit of confidence, sitting where I do. And for me, the takeaway is really about mindset, you know, and I suppose think about prevention, early intervention, but don't think of it as something separate. Think of it as mainstream, and have that thinking in any policy you're doing. And also think collaboration. I mean, what we need to try and generate is sort of win-wins, that people feel they can collaborate and there's value in it. And I suppose just as a parting shot, looking at the COVID world, there is no doubt that the way in which we've been able to respond here to COVID right across all of the policy areas has absolutely demonstrated that we do know how to collaborate, and that there are really strong working relationships and actually pretty sophisticated understandings between departments of their respective worlds. We mightn't always pretend we understand as much as we do, but when the chips have been down, that bedrock is there, so we should take some comfort from that.
Thank you, Liz. Important points again to build on what Fiacre said. Critically important that it's mainstreamed, prevention early intervention, rather than a separatist movement, and I think that was mentioned on Tuesday. And then the collaboration. And collaboration is key. I think it's not just a nice to have, or we feel good about ourselves when we're networking, but coming back to that point you made earlier in terms of actually forcing those silos to actually disappear and to force cross collaborative working at all levels across social services and policy. Paul, can I go to you finally, please?
I suppose I baked my take home into the PowerPoint, but I suppose just to pick up on that idea that often lots of different parts of governments are facing the same things, or trying to do the same thing, or facing the same issues. I think that people are having the same discussion we're having in a different part of government, but they're calling it health in all policies. You know, and I think that's the kind of thing I would like to see, you know, comparing different departments who have similar agendas and, you know, trying to work it out, rather than the kind of irony of it being an intersectoral agenda taken forward in two very different sectors.
Paul, that's a really interesting point and a very useful takeaway. I think I know what you're getting at. I think around prevention and early intervention being a unifying theme rather than a specific imperative that exists somewhere in some department. And I think if it can be used as that, approached as that, it would be really powerful. So I think that's critical. Can I just say thank you so much for everyone that joined us today. I really want to thank everybody that linked in. I would like to thank people that submitted questions. Sorry we didn't get to a lot of them. Some really interesting questions, limited for time. But I think we got under the bonnet, as I mentioned, a bit more today, and I think there are some key issues that need to be followed up, both within our own work and within government and within civil society, and our infrastructures that we have in place under Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures. So I'd like to thank Paul Carney. I thought, Paul, your input was really good and really refreshing. I'd like to say the same to Fiacre. The level of research and bringing this theme centrally within the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform has been a significant achievement, and now your leadership of well-being is a further boon to this work. Liz, as always, I think your oversight, your insight in terms of this theme has been really valuable, and I'd like to thank you for participating, and also your ongoing commitment to advancing prevention, early intervention and the What Works initiative. Barbara, really, really important insight from yourself in terms of Estonia. I think your observations and your perspectives were really sharp and spot on, and there's a lot of learning for us in Ireland in terms of the work in Estonia. But as I mentioned earlier, the speed in which Estonian social policy is addressing those intractable issues. And that's across from the youth sector to children's to early years. So really important. And I'd encourage people on the call here to actually look into the work in Estonia, because it's really a standard bearer in terms of prevention and early intervention. Finally, I'd like to thank Niamh from Centre for Effective Services and all her colleagues in terms of supporting this. I would also like to thank colleagues in the department that I work in, and that would be Kate, Bridget, Dennis, Laura and Mary, who put this work together. This planning for this, which was originally meant to be a Prevention Early Intervention Summit, but COVID has driven us to look at how we deliver these, and as a result we have these 4 sessions under the What Works programme. So I'd like to say thank you finally, and I wish you all well in these difficult times. Thank you.